Hi, this is Justin Coletti. Today on the Pro Audiophiles channel, we are going to be going into some strategies, some concepts, some tricks and techniques for getting more compression without destroying your audio. We've all been taught to be afraid of overcompression, but sometimes, especially in modern styles of production, we need to be able to apply more compression, more limiting, without messing things up and without hearing overcompression and all the negative side effects that compression can bring. So if you want to learn how to compress more with fewer side effects and better results, you're in for a treat today. We're doing this in honor of my new full-length course, Compression Breakthroughs, which just came out. Definitely want to check that out over at compressionbreakthroughs.com. But today I'm going to give you a whole lot of principles for compressing more with less destruction to your audio, and I think it's going to be a useful one for you. Because to be honest, one of the biggest problems around compression, it's not just overcompression, it's undercompression. And if you're too worried about overcompressing, you might leave your tracks undercompressed and never really sounding as full, as polished, as professional as your favorite releases. Because a big part of the sound of modern records is well-used compression and dynamic range control. But if you want to be able to use the amounts it's going to take to get the levels of polish and finish and impressiveness on your mixes, you need to know how to do it right, and you need to not be freaked out about using too much of it. And these strategies are going to help you do just that. All right, let's get right into it. To really understand overcompression, you've got to learn to hear what compression does. And in the course and on some other videos that I've done on my channel, we talk about some of the principles about how to really learn how to hear compression. And I even give you some exercises that you can do to make this happen really quickly and cut down your learning curve dramatically. But let's say that you're starting to learn to hear compression, and often enough, when you feel like you're applying enough compression to get the dynamic control you want, you're starting to hear these side effects and these artifacts that are messing up your audio. Or maybe you're so afraid of those side effects that you can't even hear that you're not compressing enough. Well, that's where these tricks come in and are going to help you out dramatically. So here it is. Trick number one for compressing your audio a lot without having to hear that compression is stacking your compressors, also known as serial compression. You've probably already heard the advice of, if you want to do a lot of compression, it's better to do a little bit on more than one different compressor instead of doing all of your compression just on one compressor. If you spread out your compression across 2 or 3 different compressors, each doing 2 or 3 dB, that's way better than compressing 10 dB on just one compressor. And that can be true. But to really take advantage of this technique properly, you gotta know why it's true. Because the reality is, if you take one compressor, and instead of making it do 10 dB of compression, you just duplicate it and you have one version of that compressor do 5 dB of compression and the other version of that compressor do 5 dB of compression, you're actually not getting all the benefits of this technique. To understand why, you got to understand one of the big side effects of compression. And just for starters, if you're using a really fast attack compressor, that means you're going to smooth out your transients. Now, one of the potential negative side effects of doing this is that you start to lose detail. You start to lose clarity. You start to lose intelligibility. The elements that you're compressing this way start to sit back further in your mix instead of leaping forward at you. So too much fast attack compression can make things sound dull and lifeless. But there's also side effects to too much slow attack compression. If you use a slow attack compressor, then you're letting your transients through. And yeah, there can be benefits to that. You get a little more clarity, you get a little more detail, you get a little more initial impact and definition. But the cost is that you get less dynamic control. And some of those elements that you're letting through, letting them pop out of the compressor can be really annoying, like the attacks of cymbals or like S's and T's on vocals. So if you use 2 fast attack compressors stacked, or 2 slow attack compressors stacked, you're not really getting the benefits of using multiple compressors. Only when you use complementary compressor settings do you start to get some of the benefits of spreading out your compression across multiple compressors. And one of the easiest ways to think about this is with fast attack and slow attack compressors being coupled together. One that's really catching those peaks and making them a little more smooth and a little bit more controlled. And then one that's bringing those compressed peaks back up a little bit to return some of your definition and now controlling the average level of your audio. So that's number one. Stack your compressors with complementary settings. And without going into too much detail in this episode, if you just take away that one kernel of couple your fast attack compressors with slow attack compressors, that's going to do you a lot of good in applying more compression across multiple compressors. All right, big approach number 2 to get more compression without all the negative side effects is parallel compression. I love parallel compression for so many reasons. You can use it on everything practically, and there's a different way to use it on everything. I just put out a new podcast episode where we explore a little bit of that on a whole bunch of different instruments. So, check out the podcast as well. I've got an episode that's called Parallel Compress Everything, and I've got a new episode out now called How to Compress Everything. And we give some specific examples in that. But right now I want to give you the basic concept. And that is, when it comes to parallel compression, you're going to take one track and compress it a ton, and then just fold that in under your main uncompressed track. There are some big benefits in this, but there's also a particular way to do it. When it comes to parallel compression, usually the best way to do it is with a super fast attack compressor. So you're making it really dynamically consistent and controlled, but you're getting around this negative side effect of losing your detail and your intelligibility and your articulation by just folding in a little bit of this fast attack compression under your main uncompressed track that still has all that life and energy in it. Now, be aware that when you do this, when you apply lots of compression to a parallel compressed track, it's often going to sound a little bit more mid-rangey and less impressive in some ways. And that's why parallel compression often means more than just compression. Good parallel compression often means applying EQ, potentially other effects like saturation, to your parallel compressed track. So you can think about it a little bit more like parallel processing than parallel compression. But in a lot of cases, you're going to do some significant brightening to your parallel compressed tracks. In the case of parallel compressed vocal, great technique. You can smooth out all of your S's and T's and sibilants with your fast attack compressor, but then bring up some of the detail and brightness in that parallel compressed track. So when you turn up that parallel compressed vocal track, you're bringing up brightness, but controlled brightness without all of the out of control sibilants getting boosted. So it can be much more useful than just boosting high frequencies on the EQ on your vocal. You now almost have this bright vocal fader that you can bring in just a little bit of, but you're bringing in controlled brightness without so many apparent side effects of compression. Similar concepts apply to drums. If you're doing this to close mics on drums, like a kick drum or a snare mic, you might do a significant amount of EQ on either of those, as well as the compression. Or on your drum bus, you might be boosting both lows and highs on a parallel compressed drum bus to give yourself a really kind of scooped, hyper-real, bombastic parallel compressed track that you're just folding in a little bit of. In a lot of cases, your parallel compressed track, even if it's 10 or 20 dB lower on the fader than your main track, it can give you some significant benefits. There are also instruments like bass that you can parallel compress, where you're compressing the low frequencies and the high frequencies separately. In the case of bass, it's usually less about having a main bass and then folding in some hyper-compressed EQ'd bass underneath it. It's usually more about splitting the bass in two and compressing your lows separately from your mids and highs. And maybe even splitting in three and compressing your lows, mids, and highs separately. So that's another principle that'll help you get lots of compression without destroying the sound of your audio. All right, our next big trick to compressing more without messing everything up is sidechaining. And this is so important, particularly if you're going to be doing mix bus compression, or compression and mastering, or compression across buses, like a drum bus, something like that. One of the problems with compression is that low frequencies have a lot more energy for the same level of audibility than mid-range and high frequencies. This means that often our audio has a lot more low end in it than mids and highs, particularly across a full mix. And if you just put your whole mix through a compressor, chances are it could be just your kick and bass that are triggering your mix bus compressor and nothing else. Sometimes this means that you want to reduce the amount of low end in your mix. But in the cases where, no, it's an appropriate amount of low end, you can just stop all that low end from triggering your compressor by turning on a sidechain filter that stops all those low frequencies from triggering your compressor. But sidechains can be used in other ways. You've probably heard about sidechaining in the context of ducking, where maybe every time a kick drum hits, it tucks down your bass or it tucks down the rest of your mix. That's another way to use sidechain filters. But sidechain filters can be used in so many ways. In fact, if you think about a de-esser, that's just a really fast attack compressor that has a sidechain in it, so it's only getting triggered by high frequencies. That's the most simple version of a de-esser anyway. And by the way, de-essing, that kind of sidechain compression, is another great way to get more compression out of vocals, particularly slower attack compressors on vocals, without having to deal with all the extra sibilance and edge and kind of annoying S's and T's jumping out. But this idea of sidechaining and the idea of parallel compression kind of dovetail into yet another idea, number 4, which is multiband compression. And there's so many ways to use multiband compression to get more compression, more dynamic control, and more tonal shaping without messing everything up and making it sound overcompressed. Often, multiband compression is associated with more modern genres and styles that require a lot of compression. And it is absolutely a good way to go on things like vocals, potentially drum buses, potentially other buses, entire mixes, potentially basses on some of those genres, where you're going to use lots of compression, but not hear it too much. But you can also use multiband compression in genres that don't call for a lot of compression. In fact, they can really shine there too. You might take a really sparse, ballady, acoustic song, but if you put a multiband compressor on the vocal, you can have it only compress the mid-range of that vocal, and only when it needs to, or only compress the lows, or only compress the chestiness of that vocal, and only when it needs to. So you can actually be more subtle with compression by using a multiband compressor. You can also dig in even heavier with a multiband compressor without hearing it quite so much by backing off on the places that don't need to be compressed and applying more compression to the places that do need to be compressed. A couple other great applications. Bass. Just like we talked about parallel compression on bass, you can do the same thing with a multiband compressor, compressing your lows separately from your mids and highs. So maybe you're applying a lot of compression to your low frequencies on that bass to make your low end really tight, really stable, but you're not over compressing the upper mid-range and taking all of the life and detail and character out of that bass. Or you could do the opposite. Compress a lot of upper mid-range and highs on that bass and let the lows be a little less compressed to give you a slightly more kind of tubby and bottom-heavy bass sound. Also totally an option, and things we explore in a lot more detail in the course too. Another useful approach on multiband compression is to use it on drum bus or in mastering context, just to focus on compressing specific areas. But this leads me into yet another thing that's related to multiband compression, and that is dynamic EQ. And all dynamic EQ is really a multiband compressor that has the interface of an EQ, but allows you to get even more targeted. I absolutely love these, particularly in mastering context, or if you're working with stems or loops or stereo submixes, where you just need to go in and reshape one area or control one area, but not touch the rest of it. I think it's an absolutely great and sometimes superior approach to using multiband compression or even to using EQ. Okay, one last idea I want to throw at you. There's so much more detail we could go into, so many more things. I could spend 10 hours talking about compression and compression techniques that allow you to get a lot more compression without making it mess up your audio. But just for today, the last one I want to give you is mid-side compression. And this is another one that's particularly useful in a mastering context, or if you're working with things like loops or mixing from stems. Mid-side compression can be great especially when you're mastering, you can do things like, there's this tom that pokes out sometimes. Let me compress just the low frequencies and just on the sides. So I'm not sucking down when the kick hits, but when this really deep tom comes out that is just mixed too high in the submix that I have, I can just tuck that down. So now we're using mid-side along with multiband compression or dynamic EQ to really target things. Or you could do the exact opposite, dive into a full mix, go into mid-side mode, and now you're compressing just the center. So you can compress just the sibilance on the vocal without reducing the clarity in cymbals. Or vice versa, compress just the high frequency of the cymbals on the sides without messing with the detail of the vocal. Or compress just the kick drum without messing with the low frequencies on the sides, or vice versa. There's so many applications there where you can do significant amount of compression, but in a really targeted, specific spot. And that is where an approach like mid-side compression is really going to help you out. Well, I hope this has been a useful start to you. Those are some of the techniques that if you come back to them again and again and again, are going to allow you to apply more and more compression, more and more dynamic control, and get even more tonal reshaping without totally messing up your sound and without worrying so much about over-compressing things. In fact, a lot of these techniques allow you to play around with over-compression in really tasteful ways. And when you start to be encouraged to play around with overcompression with techniques like parallel compression, that's when you start to really learn how to hear compression. So I really encourage you to get out there, start compressing more to learn to compress better. And if you want to learn to compress a lot better, a lot faster, I got almost 10 hours for you in Compression Breakthroughs, where not only do we go through exercises together to learn to hear compression together, we also go through a conceptual framework and a process, a step-by-step repeatable one that'll help you set compression right on every single instrument, every single time. Even if you just go through the first 2 or 3 hours in the course, the way that you hear and use compression is going to be dramatically improved forever for the better. And you are going to cut your learning curve to hear compression way, way down. Instead of it taking you 3, 5, 6, 7, 10 years to really learn to hear compression, and these are real numbers, I'm not just pulling them out of nowhere. If you don't want to take you that long to really learn how to hear and use these things, this course is going to help you leapfrog so far ahead of where you could otherwise be. Because if you're having trouble really hearing and setting compressors confidently every time, you're not alone. It was that way for me, and it was that way for so many of the best producers, engineers, and mixers working today. But it doesn't have to take so long to learn. If you learn the right conceptual framework and go through the right listening exercises, it can happen pretty quickly. And so many people who can hear it, when they finally started listening right and understanding right, they actually learn compression remarkably fast. All that not knowing how to compress was just preamble to them finally figuring out the right approaches to really learning how to hear it and set it forever for the better. And I want that to happen to you too. So I want you to check out Compression Breakthroughs. If you're not ready to take the leap yet, we've got tons of great free content right here on the Pro Audiophiles channel and over on the Sonic Scoop channel. But if you're ready to have a real compression breakthrough of your own and have it now, check it out. I get you a full masterclass on compressing each and every instrument. You want a masterclass on compressing drums? Got it for you. You want a masterclass on compressing bass? Got it for you. You want a masterclass on compressing vocals? Got it for you. For guitars, for keyboards, synths, the mix bus, mastering compression. We got masterclasses that cover all of those in great detail, as well as specific modules that dive even deeper into each of these advanced techniques around compression that we've been talking about today. If you're ready for a compression breakthrough of your own, it's the best and fastest way I know of to have one. So check it out over at compressionbreakthroughs.com. I hope to see you on the other side.